I had a later therapy today, but she said she's gonna be changing her schedule um in July, so I may have therapies at like 4 on Thursdays. I don't know, but and I was gonna cut my bangs today, but I can't find my scissors. I have to look for them because my bangs be looking stupid. This is what I wore for therapy, except for the heels. I did put these on. Didn't- but the top and these skirts I wore. And I didn't take a time after to put something else so I could be quick and read to you about Loretta Taylor. Do you see how I wrote stellette Taylor? uh, that's me tonight. That's my character. What do you throw on stage? Roses, flowers if it's a good job, uh, or tomatoes if it's horrible. No tomatoes in the chat, please. Okay, I got coffee over there. hmm Yes. See that cage is over there. I was messing around with this bed this morning. But I did find my shoes. Cleaning. Well, let me pull you guys up and then jump right in. Okay, it doesn't want to work on this phone. Fine. If you hear her barking, I mean, she's not barking right now, so you're not crazy if you don't hear anything. But if you do, it's trash nights, or it's their people coming home and probably bringing their barrels um to their house or whatever. She might hear that and bark. I can't help that. You like my skirt? Thank you. So I'd like tweet or something. I look professional for my therapy. Oh yes, okay. So she had gotten a critique from a play or something from someone, and I was just going to read the critique from James O'Donnell Bennett, who had followed her career. Um, okay. In the hands of a conventional actress, the character would be extremely insipid. Whatever Miss Taylor may be, she is not conventional, and her manipulation of the role is strikingly in point. Her treatment of it recalls the absorbing spectacle of a woman doing things to a last season's hat, pulling it aslant in one place, bestowing a fresh touch of color in another, toying in meditation that still seems not especially purposeful with a piece of velvet, or restoring a feather to its original piquant significance. Does people still wear hats? I mean, not fancy hats. I feel like if you get a hat that you look good in, you go buy it and you just like, what what a thong to do? What does that mean? I'm not wearing a thong. Do you just say that in like everyone's chat to distract them? Mhm. Where was I? Oh, okay. Because otherwise, sometimes hats can look very unfortunate. It can make your head look really big or something. Anyway, if you find the right hat, buy it. Because it looks good on you. Okay. Um, Some such ingenuity of procedure and such freshness of touch Miss Taylor has exercised in her acting. Audiences follow her maneuvers with intense interest, for she exercises in an almost uncanny way the faculty of riveting attention upon herself. And observation is constantly rewarded by the disclosure of fleeting bits of detail, swift changes of mood, little quizzical touches of emphasis, and tricks of facial play that are as unexpected as they are right and charming. It has been suggested that perhaps the actress has not yet acquired a method, but when you note the excellence of her pauses, or when you listen with her while she listens with an eloquence more illuminating than a dozen sentences would be, then you are constrained to believe that here is either an extraordinarily subtle method or an intuitive gift for expression that amounts to genius. The criticism is, see, there she goes, is interesting because in it, Mr. Bennet might be describing Lorette at the height of her career rather than the beginning. Her basic approach to acting does not change. There was to be a rounding and smoothing of her talent and a disciplining of it under Hartley Manor's tutelage. Her voice also was to be improved to correct a certain harshness and occasional flatness caused by incorrect production, but it was fruitless then as later to look for a method. Her infallible sense of the theater sprang from a deep creative rightness with which she was in tune, and which in its essence was as much a part of her at 16 as it was at 60. Lorette enjoyed all the attention she received, but however serious about her work, she did not make the mistake of taking herself seriously. She was beginning to bubble again with that excess of good spirits which was the natural inheritance of her tremendous vitality and buoyant Irish nature. After repressive years with the deaf and domineering Charlie, she was laughing again, and it felt good to laugh. Ashton Stevens, in a delightful interview at the time, catches her charm, her gaiety, her mischievous sallies, and predominantly this desire to laugh and have others laugh with her. Oddly enough, when Stevens saw Lorette in The Great John Ganton, he had forgotten the impact of the little pink and white soubrette in Scotty. He wrote that as Ganton's daughter, he found Lorette mild and forgettable. Subsequently, at a supper party, Lorette joshingly reminded him of the earlier meeting in San Francisco. In his review of Jimmy Valentine, he gave himself an anonymous kick for his myopia. An impertinent critic once wrote that improved since then. Stevens and Lorette became the best of friends, and their friendship was lifelong. Here is what he said of her and what they laughed about in 1909. This is the way it started over the telephone. It's awfully kind and flattering and such, but I'm not the star of alias Jimmy Valentine. I'm only the leading woman who pursues Jimmy. Mr. Warner is the star, and really, well, I don't know a thing about it. Mr. Warner is a noble young star, but everybody is talking about you, and I'm sure that everybody wants to hear you talk. But surely you understand the professional etiquette. You ought to. You must be old enough. You gave me my first rhetorical bouquet when I was a stage child. You gave me my first roast when I was an adult. Did I say she is very pretty? No, not yet, but she is. At least she was that afternoon when she came into the annex for a talk and tea, and I hope it is habitual. She was wearing, among other things, a down slanting hat of elephant blue, and under the eaves of it, you could see a tiny tumble of hair of the color of honey. Under that was a most animated brow and two, let us be accurate, even though descriptive of the most animated hazel eyes that ever looked at you. A little lower was one of those irregular charming, and absolutely irrelevant noses that belong to the American race alone. What? What the hell does that mean? Do I have an irrelevant nose? um, and just under that was an irregular mouth broken into the quaintest little boy smile you ever saw. It was half smile, half grin. Barry could write a play around that grin. Mark Twain may have seen it in a vision when he gave us Tom Sawyer. The first time I saw that grin, Miss Taylor, I said, by way of being impersonal, was when you were trying yourself out with Scotty, the spendthrift from Death Valley, in a melodrama. You can't surprise me with my past. I remember it terribly. Scotty didn't always appear. One evening in Denver, the newspaper men came to me and asked if the real life Scotty surely would appear. I promised him to them body, boots, and mule. And then they wrote that the man who pulled a Stetson over his eyes and rode the mule and shot the gun was only the sedentary manager who a few minutes earlier had been taking the money at the door, and that was the truth too. To hear Lee Schubert laugh as you are laughing now would be the greatest symphony ever heard. If he laughed at me, she said, that's my tragedy. I can't make my manager laugh. Then you really are serious about wanting to be funny on the stage. Why drag in that awful word serious? I don't want to be serious on the stage. I want to make people laugh. I want to be funny. When you use that word serious, you remind me of Lee Schubert breaking my heart. After he saw me play in Washington, he didn't leave a whole bone in that heart. I had such a funny part and was so funny in it, believe me, so funny. Even the audience was heard to laugh. But Mr. Schubert, there he sat in a box, looking about as lively as Edgar Allan Poe, who is dead. That is true appreciation, I said to myself. He feels it not in his face, but deep within. I felt sorry for Marie Dressler and May Irwin. I hoped they had saved enough to retire in comfort. And then I woke up, as they say, in the two a day. I was called to consciousness by the small, cool voice of Mr. Schubert. He was shaking his head from east to west and back again and saying, but you are not funny. But you are not funny. It seemed to me that he said it 1,000 times and meant it 2,000. No, I did not swoon. I smiled. Maybe it was a ghastly smile, but I smiled it. And then I commenced to argue with him. Did you ever argue to anybody how funny you are? But of course you never did. In your profession, you must be solemn and grave, the undertaker, but I must be funny. It is my mission. I don't care who does the voting if somebody only will let me be funny. Didn't you hear the audience laugh? I said to Mr. Schubert. He only wagged his head from east to west and said, but you are not funny. I may not have been funny to them, Mr. Schubert. I may not have been funny to you, you who are a businessman, a person of affairs, one who never has had the time or environment for fun. But to myself, I was funny. Oh, I knew that I was funny. I felt my soul rock with it. Lorette Taylor bewildered poor me as she must have bewildered poor Schubert, for all this came in passionate gusts through a twisted little boy's smile. And you do get the strangest surprises, she went on with eyes as straight as her mouth was crooked. Now, when I asked Mr. Schubert for my first pair of corsets, your first? Yes, she said simply. The first. I'd never worn them till last season, and then the dressmaker insisted. She said she couldn't fit me without them. I told her that I would see Mr. Schubert about it. I hastened to him. I was agitated. I guess you will have to get me a pair, I said to Mr. Schubert. Get you a pair? Me get you a pair? Why in the name of heaven should I get you corsets? Because I haven't got any. We never use them in our family. I furnish costumes. I furnish properties, but corsets. A corset is a purely private matter, Miss Taylor. Believe me. Believe me, Mr. Schubert, a corset in this instance is not at all a private matter. It is a property. A property is something you use on the stage, but not off. What did Schubert do? Bottom? and I returned them to him as soon as the part was over. You see, they were really no affair of mine at all. I put down my cup to keep from spilling the oolong. I felt as young as Miss Taylor's little boy grin. I laughed all over the place. I said to her, I'm going to shut my eyes to see you on the stage. There you are, smart. It would seem that Fifth Avenue, rather than melodrama, had been robbed. There's an urban tune in your voice, and your diction is a lesson in English. But here, now, you are funny. I swear you are. Of course I am. I've known it all along. You have survived a real test of your intelligence, and if you're annoying or if you're anything like as friendly as you look, you'll promise to send the news on a postcard to Lee Schubert. The promise was made and kept. The Tom Sawyer grin was an apt description. It was just that. There was a little boy quality about her sense of fun and mischief. She was almost as ingenious as the Mark Twain character, and certainly as unconventional. This quality combined with her beauty and a wistfulness that would ride over her gaiety at times, like mist over summer fields, held a special kind of enchantment for those who met her at this period. These were the days before Hartley Manor's influence had come strongly to bear upon her character, and as a person, she had a greater clarity of outline than she later possessed. It was a shame to teach Tom Sawyer the acts of gentility. It muddled his direction, took away some of his instinctive ability to get in and out of mischief and keep going on his golden adventures. She far preferred to laugh than to talk of her troubles. Few knew that she had any, but Jane Peyton knew. Jane could see the funny side of things, but had a sharp eye for the shadows, too. She had watched Lorette sitting in the late hours while on tour with Ganton, composing fairy stories for her children in New York. They were continued stories to be read each night by the French nurse at bedtime. It made the kids seem closer. She knew that most of Lorette's paycheck went for their care and the upkeep of nurse and apartment. Charlie was in Toronto with a new stock company, a new leading lady, and home ties, financial and sentimental, were slack. Then came news that the family doctor had stopped in on a routine call to find Dwight and Marguerite ill and unkempt, the nurse sodden with drink. Lorette had the children sent to her as soon as they could travel, and Jane helped her care for them while on the road. 4 days after Ganton opened in New York, came word that Charlie had taken off for the wilds of Alaska with his leading lady and the receipts of the Toronto Stock Company, leaving the rest of the outfit, including Sister Bessie and her brand new husband, stranded. Jane suggested there was nothing to salvage from such a marriage and urged Lorette to get a divorce at once. What's more, she was convinced that her young friend was on her way up and warned that Charlie, exercising his rights, might very well return someday to cash in on her fame. But Lorette did nothing. Divorce was a disgrace in the Dorsey Code, and Grandma Dorsey had suffered enough having a granddaughter become an actress. Add divorcee into that, and Bridget would be praying night and day for an erring granddaughter's soul. For almost a year, Marguerite and Dwight went wherever Lorette traveled. It was a life of hotel rooms and trains and backstage dressing rooms. The smell of grease paint was more familiar than fresh air. It was a life that swung bewilderingly between the carnival excitement of the theater with its bright lights, music, and laughter, where storybook people with paint on their faces always had time to play with a child, and the loneliness and severity of a hotel room where only a weary floor maid paid an occasional call through many a long and tedious hour. Children dragging them around the country, they should be. Wait, hold on. All right. Jane admonished Lorette that she was not being fair to her children, dragging them around the country. They should be in boarding school where they could have proper care. But Lorette would not consider it. She was lonely and wanted them close. Charlie's sudden return in February 1910 almost a year to the day after he had left New York, quickly changed her mind. His prodigious adventure in Alaska, where he was the first to take a traveling company through the gold towns of Yukon, had paled, and by inference, so had the charms of his leading lady. Lorette knew nothing of his return until a call came from the lobby of the apartment house where she lived with Elizabeth that Charlie was on his way up to see the children. Terrified, she rushed them from their beds and fled with them down the back stairs to Jane's. Elizabeth tried to stop Charlie at the door, telling him the children were in the country, but he pushed past her into the bedroom, fell under the crumpled sheets, and cried out, "Their little beds are still warm. My God, how could she do this to me?" Distracted with grief, now that he was back in the role of faithful husband and devoted father, he rushed into the night, fairly galloping to the bosom of his adoring sister, Helen Hunter, and put on such a show of despair that her loving heart never forgot it. Even as an old lady, she could not speak Lorette's name without her lips trembling with fury at how she treated poor Charlie. A magician of the emotions, Charlie drew them like rabbits from a hat at will. What explanation he gave of his year-long desertion while he tarried under the northern lights with the current lady of his fancy can only be imagined. Jane won her 2 points after that. Marguerite and Dwight were placed in a boarding school in Connecticut, and Lorette started divorce proceedings in New York. The skein of Charlie's life unwinds completely from Lorette's after this. Jane had been mistaken. The illusion of his own grandeur was too strong ever to allow Charlie to put himself in the position of supplicant or leech on another's fame and reputation. He never made any further attempt to interfere with Lorette's life or associate himself with her success. Streaked through the crazy hodgepodge of his temperament, a mixture of Barker, Munchausen, Francis of Assisi, adventurer, and egotist supreme, was the pride, independence, and courage that Yankee sea captains had left in his blood. He steered his crazy ship alone, stayed on the bridge no matter what the weather, and somehow made port. Lorette never saw him again. Oh, wow. After the divorce, Charlie became a part of her life which she never discussed. When she achieved sufficient prominence to be interviewed and was asked about her early struggles, she never referred to him except as the manager or the producer. When at last she could bring herself to mention him at all as her husband, she blandly had him die in 1910, the year of the divorce. As far as she was concerned, he did. Actually, he lived to the ripe old age of 76 and died in California in 1942. But Lorette felt more comfortable having him dead, so she killed him in 1910. She never lost an almost childish fear of her first husband. When Charlotte visited New York in the early 1930s, after some 20 years in the West, Lorette's children were amazed to find her in a highly agitated state. She was afraid he would make trouble, cause her some kind of unwelcome publicity, try to see her. It was difficult to convince her that he was a harmless, fantasy ridden fellow in his mid 60s, almost entirely forgotten by the theater world. Her picture of him was that of a ruthless, domineering man, still callously indifferent to her welfare. There was obviously some wound that never closed. The last two typed pages of Lorette's unfinished recollections were devoted to Charles A. Taylor. She was proud of the objectivity she had finally attained and said to her daughter on one of their last visits together, "I think I have the perspective now to see how he fitted into my life and to say what he taught me in the theater." It was a perspective that had taken her 35 years to achieve. The young and energetic producing team of George M. Cohen and Sam Harris did not agree with Lee Schubert that Lorette was not funny. They took over Hartley Manor's comedy Miss Brown Burglar from the Schuberts, retitled it The Girl in Waiting, and offered Lorette a 5-year contract, which stipulated stardom at the end of 3 years. She said yes. The Schubert said no. There were claims and counterclaims as to obligations fulfilled and unfulfilled. Lorette felt that the Schuberts, after two bad plays and apparently no ideas on developing her career except to state that she was not to play comedy, had no further claims on her services. Her Irish was up. I walked into their offices with my shabby shoes and my flat purse, and I said to them, I'm going to fight you. I can't be any poorer than I am, so I'm going to fight you. Okay. Okay. The fight was brief. A court ruled that the Schuberts, by raising Lorette's salary voluntarily when she made her first success with them, had automatically abrogated the terms of the original contract. We parted company, the best of enemies, never to meet again. The Girl in Waiting opened in Philadelphia April 19th, 1910. It was Philadelphia's turn to discover Miss Taylor. Hitherto unknown and unheralded, the notices were pallid compared to those she had received previously in far less important roles, but Philadelphians liked her and the play well enough to demand 13 curtain calls on the opening night. Cohen and Harris were sufficiently pleased to elevate her to stardom then and there instead of waiting the stipulated 3 years. The first Lorette knew of it was when she turned into the street where the Garrick Theater was located and saw her name in electric lights over the marquee. Completely dumbfounded, she said to Harris, Don't you think you've picked me a little green? To which Harris replied, Like a bunch of bananas, you'll ripen. He went on to explain that he and Cohen had decided she might just as well take the plunge now as later, that it was easier to advertise a star than a leading lady. Lorette didn't have it much thought one way or the other, except that it would mean an opportunity for better parts. When the Chicago opening drew near after a 2 month summer layoff, the full implications of what stardom meant dawned upon Lorette. All over the town, which had received her so cordially in Ganton and Jimmy Valentine, were 8 sheet posters with her picture, electric lights spelled her name in 2 foot letters over the Olympic Theater. Theatrical columns were full of happy anticipation at seeing the young actress whom Chicago had discovered blossom into her full-fledged star. Suddenly, and for the first time in her life, Lorette knew panic. On opening night, she was taut with nerves, and from the outset, keyed her performance impossibly high. An individual little chuckle which had characterized her performance in Philadelphia as to sound like, and which had been termed most effective, became so insistent as to sound like the prelude to hysteria. At the close of the performance, it was obvious to all that she was in a state of bordering on collapse. No one knew better than Lorette that she had failed to meet the test of stardom. On her curtain call, she stepped to the footlights and, in a breathless and completely disarming little speech, told her audience, Those twinkling little lights are very hard to live up to. I know tonight I have not done so. Her friends, the critics, mourned. Mr. Hammond wrote, In the course of the proceedings last night, Lorette Taylor made the suggestion which stifles, if it does not altogether choke, the words of criticism which we otherwise should utter. This suggestion was to the effect that her elevation to stellar glory had stampeded her and left her dazed artistically. It becomes our painful duty to report the usual possibilities indicated by previous performances were not realized. After remarking on the unhappy chuckle, he went on to say, We beseech Miss Taylor to return to the refreshingly unmannered manner of her minor career. All we ask is that she give her best to everything she does. Mr. Bennet was inconsolable. Here we get the Lorette Taylor of the wonderful facial play in The Great John Ganton, nor the wonderful pauses and the searching emotional thrust in Alias Jimmy Valentine, nor yet the Lorette Taylor of the still pathos of Mimi in The Devil. Instead, it was Lorette Taylor thrust into the role of Hoyden and enacting it along conventional lines, neither much better nor any worse than scores of smart girls on the American stage could. Faint praise indeed from one who had been urging Lorette to essay Shakespeare and take her place with the great ones of the theater. Lorette joined in the wake. She beat her breast in public with a will. All the lovely things that had been said about me in the papers before the opening, instead of encouraging me, made me tremble. I knew that I could never live up to the idea the critics had of me. And I didn't. I really don't know what they wanted me to do, but whatever it was, it seems that I did not do it. She noted that all the nice things they did have to say had ended with a but. I'm going to make them say all those lovely things about me someday without any buts. I have all the ambition in the world. I've made the plunge, and after the first shock, the water's fine. Ashton Stevens came backstage to offer suggestions. He made the mistake of criticizing the play. Lorette flew at him. She had fallen more than ever in love with the author, and nothing he could do, including his playwriting, could be wrong. He prob- Her problems had nothing whatever to do with the play, she stated flatly. It was entirely her fault. The play, she told Stevens, was obviously written by someone with a knowledge of inherited silverware, and I don't know anything about inherited silverware. That's the trouble. She was more defensive than right about the play. Hammond thought it written in the author's usual bright and alert fashion, but Bennett found it a tedious and incredible farce and felt his protege wasted in it. Mr. Manners was heard to grumble rather peevishly. They talked as though Sarah Bernhardt had been asked to play in Charlie's Aunt. Maybe only Mr. Schubert was happy. The Girl in Waiting closed after only so-so success on the road. It was not good enough to warrant bringing it into New York. Okay, next chapter. Hartley Manners. It was like Lorette to characterize Hartley's playwriting as that done by a man with knowledge of inherited silverware. She thought she knew whereof she spoke. Jane had managed to get the two of them together at last. During the 2 months summer layoff of the play before the opening in Chicago, and it had been a little bit like trying to join a quiet brook with a highly agitated arm of the sea. The result had been more of a whirlpool than the hoped for confluence of their two personalities. Possibly only such an arch matchmaker as Jane would ever have thought of trying. Hartley was 40 years old that summer in 1910, which marked the beginning of their courtship. Lorette was 26. Where she was undisciplined and impetuous in her emotions, he was disciplined and deliberate. His manners were perfect. Lorette had none. He abhorred scenes of any kind. Lorette lived by them. Lorette was disorderly in her habits. He was methodical in the extreme. In some ways, he was as bound by tradition as the proverbial Englishman who dresses for dinner every night in the depth of the jungle. His morning bath, the press of his trousers, the proper strength of his tea were all ritual with him. Lorette was right. The air of inherited silverware sat easy on him. Inherited silverware. I like, wouldn't that imply that like your parents are dead or that your family has like a lot of silverware and you have no siblings or you have a lot of siblings and there's like an awful lot of what the hell does that or are you I don't know. Who cares about this damn silverware? I use disposable silverware, plasticware, if you will. So I don't know like Hartley. No one knew a great deal about Hartley's past. He had cronies rather than close friends. Those with whom he played bridge regularly tipped a friendly glass at a bar or exchanged anecdotes by the hour while sitting in the deep chairs of his various clubs. You like your tea very specifically. How very British of you. Or exchange anecdotes by the hour while sitting in the deep chairs of his various clubs. Anecdotes of the theater or prize fighting of which he was extremely fond, or the position of an Englishman in the world, or the intransigence of the Irish, but never confidences. Few had knowledge of him beyond the bare facts of his career as an actor and playwright, which began in 1898 when he was 28. In that year, he served his apprenticeship as an actor, touring Australia with Charles Cartwright for 6 months. His first London appearance was in 1899 at the St. James Theatre with Sir George Alexander. He remained with that distinguished actor's company for 2 years. He wrote The Queen's Messenger as a curtain raiser for Sir George. It became such durable dramatic fare that for the next 18 years it was the most frequently performed one actor by amateurs, playing in all parts of the world, and eventually was the first dramatic production to be given on the new medium, television, in 1928. He made his playwriting and acting debut in America in 1902 with Lily Langtry in The Crossways, which they co-authored. Jane did not meet him until he returned to America in 1904 with Henry Miller, with whom he appeared in the original production of Henry Arthur Jones, Joseph Entangled. Not even Hartley's best friends could say that he was a good actor. Actors of the day, or no, okay, it can only be said that he was thoroughly exposed to the great actors of the day. Charles Hawtrey, J. Forbes Robertson, he played Laertes in the latter's production of Hamlet. Herbert Beerbohm Tree, the theater, however, was part of his blood. His broad experiences in it were to make him one of the best directors and all round theater men in the business, but his acting remained consistently abominable. His style was wooden, and to hide a chronic stage fright, he tended to become stiffly declamatory in speech. It was a sort of slow rigor mortis which overtook a naturally easy and beautiful delivery. Hartley's acting career was mercifully brief, 1898 to 1905, but his playwriting continued to flourish. Mm, In this, he was indefatigable, turning out script after script. Many of his earliest efforts he took to a young friend, Ethel Barrymore, for criticism. A quiet no Hartley from Ethel sent him off again to write another. He had great respect for her judgment. They were very English, Pinero-like plays, Ethel recalled. He didn't really hit his stride until he met Lorette. That was the great explosion of his life. We all knew him as Jack Manners in London when he was an actor. He became J. Hartley when he turned playwright. Half a dozen Broadway productions soon established him on the American scene as a dramatist of note. The year of the great John Ganton, he had two other plays running in New York, The Patriot with William Collier and The House Next Door, which served the highly expert comedian J.E. Dodson for 3 seasons. The first 28 years of Hartley's life remain a mystery. Few people felt they knew him well enough to ask about them. In his Who's Who biographical sketch, this period is covered with the phrase privately educated. The only bit of information ever dredged up was that somewhere in his young past, a Jesuit priest had exerted a strong influence in his life. So strong that at one point he had begun a course of training for the priesthood. But this training had stopped short of entering a seminary. I don't know if you want to be a priest. I hear it's very political, like any other job. You know what I mean? I heard people that got fired as a priest and not for doing like, you know what I mean? Like the things that you would think. No. Um, other than this, those 28 years are a blank. Jane, a born intrigant, was sure that he was the illegitimate child of some noble house of England. If true, the secret was well kept. He not only died with it locked in his bosom, but in a final fillip to the mystery after a lifetime of impenetrable reserve and with absolutely no compulsion to do so revealed in his will the names of one Martin and Annie Dunn of London, England, who Lorette subsequently learned were Hartley's brother and sister, and to whom he left a considerable sum of money. This might be considered to have solved the mystery, but upon taking a look at Martin and Annie Dunn, it only became deeper. They were sandy haired, sandy complexioned, spindly little cockneys, 20 years or so younger than Hartley. And only if the whole theory of heredity was abrogated could they pass as brother and sister to the Hartley manners of the black waving hair and white Irish skin, of the strongly established structure of brow and nose and width of eye that no set of genes could throw out and then so completely forget in subsequent progeny of the same parents. If anyone could pry out a secret, it was Jane, but she made no headway with Hartley on this one. She remained convinced that he was hiding a royal, if slightly irregular, ancestry. Lorette, surprisingly enough, asked few questions. Hartley's reticence in itself was almost as mysterious to her as any explanation of it could be. She was fascinated by it and accepted it as an integral part of his personality. It was part of living with him to know nothing about him. You could not be intimate with the deepest aspects of Hartley's nature. You could not be intimate with his kindness, his humor, his gentleness, and his love, but in this intimacy he reserved his personal history and, in a large measure, what that history had done to his soul. Lorette did not press. To her, the demarcation between being born to the purple, if such he was, or being sufficiently absorbent to acquire all the attributes of one so born was faint. Her theater sense made the two things equally impressive, and to separate the true from the false in the matter would have been as depressing and thankless a job as unraveling truth from fantasy in her own life. His gentleman ways were all of one piece, whatever their origin. They came with him along with his extraordinary reticence as to where he had acquired them. Were they a compound or were they a compound of the parts he played? Lord Scarlett of the Crossways, Lord Chetland in the Squire of Dames, or perhaps the elegancies of Crocker Harrington in Pinero's Iris. Who knew? Who cared? It was Laurette's attitude. When you loved him, you lived with this distinct pattern and you never questioned it. His reserve was as much a part of him as his fine, slim feet, his beautiful hands, and this extraordinary gentleness of manner. So much so that if one circumstance had chipped the smallest piece from this pattern, she would have felt a little bit as though the world were coming to an end. Indeed, in the last year of his life, when mental and physical suffering cracked ever so slightly his poise, the inner reserve, it did seem to Lorette that the world was falling in ruin, and when he was gone, chaos came and sat on her shoulder, an intimate and horrific bird, as though it had broken from the strong cage which Hartley had built to hold it prisoner. But the end of the love story of Hartley and Lorette was a long way off in the summer of 1910, and the beginning had not yet begun. It was middle June when Lorette stepped off the train at Winstead, Connecticut, and was met by Jane in a smart two-seater buggy with a lively chestnut mare between the shafts. They bowled off down the road, and presently turned off into a hard dirt road, which they went for several miles. Only an occasional cow peered through scrub woods. As they passed a group of farm buildings, I'm telling you, Rob, this is your house. Jane sang out a halloo to learn or to a lean man in the yard. Pawdew was the only human imprint on the land until they arrived at Jane's big rustic lodge overlooking a mirror clear little lake skirted by trees. Jane did not announce at once that Hartley was coming. First, Lorette was to greet her children, who had been visiting at Lake Wongsunk Monk since the closing of school. Then she was taken out on the broad veranda of the lodge. Jane wanted to have the quiet, sylvan beauty of the place exert its full charm before showing Lorette the cabin she and the children were to occupy for 2 months. High Rock Cottage was on the shore just opposite Jane's and was more rock than cottage. The huge boulder upon which it was built formed a hazardous hump in the center of one of the two tiny rooms. A couple of iron beds filled the other. An afterthought of a kitchen, broom closet size, and supported by stilt-like posts, jutted from one wall. They had scarcely begun their inspection when Jane, to forestall any disappointment in the cottage, broke the news that Hartley would be one of several guests for the weekend. Jane's offstage timing was perfect. Quiet sylvan beauty is only a relative term when applied to any landscape Jane inhabited. In no time, that landscape would be crawling with celebrities, semi celebrities, the social and the antisocial. Jane loved human beings, and in her company, even the most inimical personalities behaved humanely toward each other. Her rough chateau was the focal point of the social activities of the surrounding countryside. Hidden away down narrow, rutted lanes along the lakeside, and back on wooded knolls were various writers and artists pursuing a yin existence through the summer to reinvigorate their yang activities. During the winter, there was Edward Sheldon, the playwright, Edward Childs Carpenter, poet and playwright, Willard Metcalf, the painter, Channing Pollock, the Charles Rayan Kennedys, she the lovely Edith Wynne Matheson, the emotional actress Helen Ware, whose specialty was tearful heroines. Shelley and Henry Hull lived down in Pleasant Valley, a mile or two away. On weekends, Jane's rambling abode was filled with house guests. Carl Van Vechten, Will Irwin, Amy Lowell, Clara Louise Kellogg, the opera diva, both whom smoked black cigars, Doris Keene, Samuel Hopkins Adams, who was to be Jane's fourth husband, and scores of others. Lorette felt like a rather small frog in this impressive social splash, but was determined to make the most of the week-end that Hartley was to spend at Jane's. She tore up and re-sewed a couple of tired-looking dinner dresses, one green and the other yellow. She did her hair a new way, adding a long switch and wearing the heavy mass low on her neck. And she practiced up on her swimming. This latter was the easiest part. The children lived in the lake, and she adored the water. Hartley arrived with a flock of other guests, and Lorette began a headlong pursuit. Hartley was extremely popular with the ladies. He listened most effectively with large, gentle brown eyes fastened upon his feminist vis-a-vis, a slightly melancholic look from time to time creeping into his gaze. They were never quite sure at the end of the evening whether he had fallen half in love with them or half asleep. It generally titillated them to further efforts to find out. He was an excellent bridge player. Lorette's game was aboriginal, but finding that he liked to play, she played too. He offered to teach her some of the rules of the game. Heaven, then he offered to teach two other ladies. Heck, The four sat at a table. Lorette was the least apt of his pupils. When this became painfully obvious, she decided she didn't want to play anymore and walked away. If she had been an expert knife thrower, she would have hurled a couple of knives over her shoulder to pinion the two apt pupils left behind. The next afternoon, some of the women guests were to swim to the end of the mile-long lake. The men were to follow, each in a rowboat, in case someone couldn't make it. Lorette thought, now, ladies, watch my smoke. She stayed as close as possible to Mr. Manners' boat, feathering her fingers prettily at her backstroke and getting her mouth full of water, smiling up at him. Her showing off soon had her exhausted. The swimmers were allowed to stop at any point and rest. As rest was becoming imperative for Lorette, she decided to use it for a test of Mr. Manners' interest. Everybody was going down one side of the lake. Lorette thought, I'll swim on the other side to rest. If he doesn't follow me, I'll know he doesn't care a darn. She pulled away for the opposite shore and presently heard oars splashing untidily behind. Her heart leapt excitedly. A very flushed Mr. Manners drew alongside with his black curly hair for once not neatly in place. Are you all right, Miss Taylor? He asked. Quite, said Lorette. Good, he said. Some of the other swimmers started over. I thought you were in trouble, he said. I was and am, Lorette said with a look. What can I do? Shall I row you back to the house? The others arrived. So, Hartley Manners, little you care about us, they shouted. Your rowboat is supposed to follow all of us, dearie. If Lorette's quitting, let her be. We don't want to be at this all day. Lorette drew herself up on one of the many rocks that jutted out of the water by the shore. Go along if you want to, she said to Mr. Manners. If she thought that he would stay, she was mistaken. He set off briskly down the lake with the rest of his charges splashing and lapping around him, and Lorette was left to brood in solitary glory as the hazards of sportsmanship when one is trying to charm an Englishman. The weekend was almost over. On the last evening, everybody played bridge. A thunderstorm was brewing, and Lorette, who had commandeered the seat opposite Hartley, grew more and more nervous. There was a sudden clap of thunder, and she jumped up, scattering her cards. Here we sit, playing the devil's game with God's anger all around us, she cried, and fled into a small, heavily curtained den off the living room. The game broke up and Hartley followed her into the den. Come and look at it, he said, making a gesture toward one of the curtained windows. It's really beautiful. No, 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 Lorette cried with rising emphasis, shrinking back. All her coquetry was gone. It was real and deadly fear she had of thunder and lightning. My grandmother used to say, you could see the face of God if you looked, she murmured in a small, scared voice, and that it curled some and blinded others according to the state of grace you're in. She smiled uncertainly at Hartley, her fingers weaving together in a small, fluttering movement as she tried to conquer her fear. Hartley let his eyes rest on her face for a long, long moment. Then he reached out and briefly touched her hand. You're a curious child, Laurie, he said with a great gentleness. He was gone the next morning early. Jane pronounced the weekend an unqualified success. Lorette didn't know. The melody of that voice calling her Laurie stayed with her. The beauty of his face that bore at times so melancholy a look, as though he sought access to some lost world of his youth. She had never known such gentleness of spirit. In his presence, she felt like a wild, untrained puppy, and like a puppy brimming over with an undisguisable love. Many a night for the remainder of her stay at the lake, she went into her tiny cottage, drew tight the curtains, lit the lamp, and buried her head in a book. I'm sorry, I thought they were going to say bury her hand between her legs because I'm sure she did that too, but This was written in the 1950s, and I don't think her daughter would say that, but let's be honest, so wouldn't you if this was your crush? Um, and this wasn't even the 1950s, this was like the early 1900s, so what else did you have for entertainment? I just thought that was funny how she says, "Oh, you could go ahead if you want." How it's like to men, like you have to like spell it out sometimes. Like they don't pick up on like you're playing hard together. It's like a test. They literally just think you can go. Like, oh, okay. Like you want me to go? Or like guys don't ever pick up like if you like them or if you're what you're talking about. Maybe you have to like literally say, I like you, or like, please stay. I don't know. uh She did not want to see the moon on the quiet surface of the lake or hear the murmur of the leaves in the soft night breeze, for they were all part of the melodic voice, the beautiful face, and the gentle spirit that she was still not at all sure could be won. Jane had no doubts. Hartley was invited again later in the summer, and from this weekend Jane plucked a sign which she considered the brightest harbinger for the future of the romance. Partly attired in a borrowed bathing suit, allowed himself to be strapped into a large cork life preserver, and with feet encased in immaculate white sneakers, plunged off Jane's dock into the lake where Lorette and various house guests were disporting themselves. It was the one and only time that Hartley was known to immerse himself in water outside a bathtub. This courageous effort to enjoy what Lorette enjoyed proved almost fatal. It, in some inexplicable manner, the life preserver became firmly wedged around his head, and with the feeblest flipping motion of sneakered feet, he revolved helplessly in slow circles. He was so frightened that even his instinct to survive was half paralyzed. Jane considered this a demonstration of love equal to that of Leander swimming the Hellespont, and even Lorette was impressed. Before leaving to resume her role in The Girl in Waiting in August, Lorette told Jane that she was returning the next summer. Marguerite and Dwight, in spite of string bean structures inherited from their father, had put on weight thanks to Pa Dew's cream and milk and eggs. They hadn't had shoes on their feet the entire summer and were supremely happy. Lorette was determined they should have more of it. Perhaps Hartley will come too, Jane said archly. Not him, replied Lorette. His idea of roughing it is to change from a double-breasted blue serge suit to a pair of perfectly pressed white flannels. What would he do on this lake all summer? That would depend on you, replied Jane. Jane's laughing eyes and lips could make you feel a romance was three-quarters settled before it even begun. But you couldn't hang a romance on the one word lorry and a jump in the lake, no matter how optimistic you were. Next chapter. Nothing half so sweet in life. How much Lorette saw of Hartley that winter is not a matter of record. Probably not as much as she wanted to, and certainly not enough to be sure that he was as much in love with her as she was with him. Hartley was infinitely shy of the feminine and more than a little attached to his bachelorhood. This, with his extreme reticence, kept Lorette in considerable doubt as to the degree of his devotion. Moreover, she was used to forthright and immediate expression. Anything else bewildered her. It is not inconceivable that many a tentative advance on Hartley's part went unnoticed in her own somewhat whirlwind approach to their romance. The sea and the brook, the same element, but so differently paced in their rhythm. Undoubtedly, there were scenes. It was Laurette's firm conviction reaching back to her childhood that differences of opinion made life exciting, and that the stormier the expression, the greater the degree of one's affection. If Hartley was tardy in keeping an appointment, then and next to Lorette he was one of the tardiest of human beings, she would berate him, not so much because she was angry as because she was anxious for some revealing fervor on his part. The invariable and rather pallid excuse that he was finishing a rubber at the club, old dear, was to Laurette altogether. Oh, thank you, Jerry. Congratulations, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Altogether unsatisfactory. By her own admission, she indulged in many a scene of anger and jealousy. My own rival seems to be bridge, but I attacked it as I would a blood one. Hartley was not an easy man to provoke. He would reason, but would not argue. If she persisted in argument, he would very politely take his hat, gloves, and cane to return to his club. You have an undisciplined tongue, Laurie, he once told her, and it would be sad if you said something you would regret. I never regret anything I say, she responded hotly. That's bold. It would be even more sad if I could not forget something you would say. I believe I would forgive anything you said, but forgetting is something else again. This was a new kind of talk for an Irish girl who had exploded into speech on every and any occasion, whether it hurt somebody or not. She was baffled, fascinated, and often miserably unsure as to whether he loved her or not. Are you going to stay and argue with me? She would almost plead at times. You'll lose him with that tongue of yours, Elizabeth would caution. He's a fine gentleman, and he won't stand for any of your sass. I'm warning you now. Laurette would bite her tongue, and the next time Hartley was late, would wonder if he would come at all. She opened in New York in Seven Sisters, February 1911. Before leaving for Chicago in April, her uncertainty had largely vanished. Hartley had outlined a play with her in mind and asked Jane to find him a place on the lake the next summer to work on it there. For a shy conservative Englishman, Laurette considered that tantamount to a proposal. I don't know what finish a rubber at the club means. I don't know. Yes, thank you again, Jerry. I looked up and I saw all this green, 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 like from Jerry, from Jerry, from Jerry. Seven Sisters was another astonishing success. Quite solemnly, producer Daniel Frohman had warned, I'm not going to star you, Miss Taylor. That's quite all right, Mr. Frohman, replied Laurette. Michi is the part. Whether I'm starred or not doesn't matter. It's the chance of a generation, a white topsy I can't miss, and she didn't. Oh, what a jolly mix-up, crowed Stevens in his review. When she was a star, she wasn't. And now that she isn't, she is. She wanted to be funny, you may remember. They made her a star for a teacup comedy by Hartley Manners, and she tried very hard to be, but wasn't at all funny. Her starship seemed to scare all the fun out of her, but Charles Cherry's starship relieved her of all fright completely, and she relieves him of starship. Here and there, a reviewer managed to maintain a sober critical faculty in the face of the whirlwind impudence of her performance. There were minor dissonances in the chorus of praise. A carelessness of speech was noted, a growing excess of zeal for natural effects. There was the impression of a lack of discipline and control. As Laurette put it, before I knew Hartley, I tended to spill over in everything I did. But Laurette was in no mood to be admonished. Life was beginning to expand. After years of grinding work, she was free of Charlie and was at last making progress with the shy Mr. Manners. She was spilling over, and it was not unnatural that it should take on the tomboy quality of her youth. The survival instincts of the tomboy had been hearty. The tenderer emotions were in abeyance, waiting the proper soil and climate. Now that she was in love, she was reaching out, but tentatively. She still found it safer to laugh, and she wasn't going to let a mere bunch of critics take the soul-saving grace of laughter away from her. A rubber in bridge is winning 2 games. How did you know that, John? Do you pull a rubber at the club? What? Okay. um, there is great insouciance in the picture of Lorette at this period in her life, a child released from certain irksome fetters, insisting upon enjoying herself, and still not too particular about dignity and importance. The role of romping 14-year-old Michi fit in her mood perfectly. Seven Sisters was still doing good business in Chicago when she left the cast in June 1911 to Wonk Sonk Bonk. Hartley was already occupying what Pa Dew had rather grandly described as a 7-room cottage called Sunset Lodge. Actually, it was one room which could be divided into 7 compartments by drawing a number of faded gingham curtains. The bed occupied one compartment, a wash bowl and pitcher another, oil stove and table another, and so on. There were kerosene lamps and an outhouse reached by a path through the woods. When Lorette saw Sunset Lodge, she was more certain than ever that Hartley must be in love with her. Hartley never indicated in any way that the place was less than a palace, and in these rustic surroundings proceeded to conduct his life exactly as he would have in the heart of London or New York. Every morning at 9 a.m., a flat bottomed boat was rowed down the lake by one of the Dew boys with a large copper tub of steaming hot water on the back seat for Hartley's morning bath. An hour or so later, an elderly Frenchwoman was similarly transported, bearing in her arms piles of snowy laundry, including his perfectly ironed shirts. The Tatler, the Sketch, the London, and the New York Times appeared regularly in Pa Dew's mailbox, and these were waterborne the half-mile down the lake to the lodge. Visitors coming by rowboat or along the lane by the lake shore would find Hartley attired in immaculate white flannels and custom tailored shirt, wearing perhaps a checked cap as his one concession to rustic life. With quiet enthusiasm, he would demonstrate to those interested the exact manner in which the limply hanging curtains could be pulled in order to avail oneself of the ultimate privacy they afforded. Many a morning, Lorette stood at her window at High Rock Cottage, watched the steaming copper tub rowed by, and chuckled with delight. I feel like Delilah, she said, having wooed my Englishman so far from his native haunts, if not his habits. It was Sunset Lodge that Hartley wrote Peg O' My Heart. It took him 4 months. He carefully explained to Lorette his working methods. His scripts were completely rewritten 4 times. The first version was formal and didactic. In the initial stages, the story was pushed along, the scenes laid out more or less mechanically. Gradually, with each rewriting, the script became more supple and alive. Work on the dialogue came last. For this reason, he would not read the play to her until it was virtually completed. But this, of course, would never do for Lorette. She must hear it as soon as it was down on paper. So, one afternoon, with considerable reluctance, Hartley gave in. They sat on the porch of Sunset Lodge, author with cap pulled low over his eyes to shade them from the sun, pipe in the corner of his mouth. Once again, Lorette was warned not to expect too much. Then Hartley began to read. He grew absorbed. His beautiful voice went on and on, muted music, the diction impeccable. At last it was finished. How do you like it? He asked. Hartley, it's awful, came Lorette's prompt reply. So ended the first reading of Peg O' My Heart, the play that was to make the fame and fortune of both. That's funny. Hartley, it's awful. Hartley vowed that he would not let Lorette see the play again until it was finished. But she was persuasive. He would admit to having completed a couple of scenes, and the next thing he knew, they would be walking through the woods arm in arm to Sunset Lodge so that he could read them to her. Each time there was an argument, or at least Lorette did everything she could to start an argument, until finally the readings were given up because Hartley found them too discouraging. Lorette felt like a little girl being punished, but Hartley was adamant. It was his breeding child, and she could wait until it was completed. Nevertheless, he was absorbing much of the living spirit of Pig through Lorette. On many a star-studded night, they strolled and talked, and many a long, lazy afternoon sat on Jane's wide porch while Lorette told tales of her childhood. Do you think more people fall in love in the summer? Like maybe it's easier because I don't know. I mean, you could fall in love at any time, but you certainly wear less in the summer, which helps, I guess. I'm just thinking, sitting on a porch, how romantic, but the sun stays out later, you know? um, While Lorette told tales of her childhood, her Irish family, particularly her peppery little grandmother, the turn of phrase Bridget used, so essentially humorous and invariably delivered without humor, her steadfast religion, her tart and immediate summation of character, her pride and peasant sense of her place in the world, the dignity of being a decent, God fearing human soul, partly found in Bridget Dorsey's granddaughter many of the characteristics that made Peg loved by the millions throughout the entire world. The spirit of youth, both the directness and the clear innocence of a child, penetrating wisdom of one who remains simple in heart and unsuborned by compromise. Peg, if ye must know, is my grandmother, Lorette once told a reviewer, but Peg also was Lorette. Hartley did his writing at night. It was a habit formed during years of city living, and even here in the quiet of the woods, he would wait until there were only the deep throated comments of the frogs to keep him company before taking up his pencil to work. From midnight on were his working hours. At 5 in the morning, he would retire, with breakfast at 11 or later. Jane and Lorette spent their mornings in a strict regimen of health, observing that Lorette was beginning to curve a little too much for beauty. Jane quoted Diane Foucault's 3 rules for an actress. First rule, keep your figure. Second rule, keep your figure. Third rule, keep your figure. Whoa, you're breaking the rules. As Lorette said, I was born around everything eyes, cheeks, lips, figure. That summer saw the tentative beginning of Lorette's relentless fight with fats. If the Manners family had been entitled to a coat of arms, the word reducing would have been engraved upon it. Every summer for 16 years, family life revolved around Lorette's reducing. She did not go about it quietly or unobtrusively. It was as dramatic a performance as she ever put on. A favorite quotation was Irving Cobb's retort to a friend who asked if he hadn't lost a few pounds. Hell, what do you mean lost? I went to the mat with it and won. But these Herculean efforts were to come later. The mornings at the lake were not too strenuous. A swim in the lake and a delightful, if unsatisfying, lunch on Jane's screen dining porch. By the time Hartley appeared on the scene, Lorette was, in the words of Peg, sick for the sight of him. Aw, sick for the sight of him. In the afternoons, people came from all points of the compass, irresistibly drawn into the orbit of Jane's sunny sociability. They appeared along faintly marked paths through the woods or by rowboat or canoe. Some came by car. Some were met at the railroad station by any number of swains who sat about waiting to do Jane's bidding. There were swimming and games and hours of talk. It was talk that was animated and entertaining, engaged in by some of the most brilliant minds of the day. At any other time, Lorette would have been in the center of it, reveling in the quick play of ideas, contributing her own highly original, if not always informed, remarks on any and all subjects that might be introduced. But lovers are self-absorbed. Hartley and Lorette listened mainly to each other. He recounted stories of the great actors with whom he had played, the techniques and manners of another era in the theater, while Lorette regaled him with tales of Western stock and early family life. They walked together, rode together. He was too terrified of the water ever to try the more romantic canoe, played bridge together. In the evening, they sat on High Rock Cottage's rickety bird's nest of a porch. With the children asleep inside, he read aloud from his favorite authors, George Meredith, Thackeray, Anthony Trollope, Kipling. Solemnly, he advised, when you feel like reading a new book, read two old ones instead, and you will feel well read. He gave her a Victor talking machine, introduced her to the voices of Melba, Caruso, Squatty, Sembrick. When he was not there, Lorette read passages from the books to her children, played the records again and again. It brought him close, but it was so tenuous and shy a courtship with so much left unsaid. She often wondered what was going on in that gentle mind of his, behind that infinitely gentle gaze. She loved to see the look of tender astonishment spreading over his face at something she would say. In that look was the wonder of discovery, of pure delight that a musician might have on hearing an infinitely pleasing chord, or a poet catching the worded rhythm of an innermost revelation, but oh so gentle. How was she to encompass this love or be encompassed by it? It made her feel clumsy and awkward, and because it still was not declared in word or action, other than this look of wonder and adoration, she was afraid to approach too close lest it shatter or dissolve before her very eyes. Many a night Lorette saw Hartley off down the tree-lined lane by the lake, watched him disappear, swinging his lantern with the finicky step of a man who prefers pavements, then went back to her own little porch to stare for long minutes across the star-bright waters of the lake. There were times when, in all that quiet, she seemed to be holding her breath to listen to the beat of her own heart. The tiny waves lapping the pebbled shore echoed the sound, faintly, sibilantly, as though they carried it out through the night to be lost on some distant sill of infinitude. Lorette, Lorette, who is she? For the first time, Lorette tried to answer that question. She had run away from it all her life in stormy revolt or dreamlike projections of her fancy. But because of her love for Hartley, an answer seemed now imperative. She had measured herself by storms, opposition, failure, her ability to survive emotional turmoil in herself and in those around her. But in Hartley, there was no such turmoil. In a way, she felt more lost than ever, surrounded by his quiet and selfless devotion. She wanted more than anything else in the world to become a part of it. But how? Her aggressiveness covered a multitude of bewilderments about him. She tried to test him with scenes, but he would not have scenes. She demanded passionate declaration, but it was not in his nature to so declare himself. She found herself waiting with a humility quite unlike her to be shown the life he would make for them both. Kiss him! Kiss him! I have one of those old cylinder record. You too? Do you ever listen to it? As she stood listening to the beat of her heart and the tiny echo of the waves, she was conscious for the first time of the great swinging rhythms in life that can come flood tide without violence and without destruction, and of which there is no reason to be afraid. Lorette was leaving a childish confusion about such matters behind. She had waited so long to give herself to love, neither defiantly nor cravenly, but proudly and with deep confidence. She waited now, impatient, somewhat bewildered, to be shown the way. Inside, one of the children stirred on the iron cot. She had almost forgotten them. They were off most of the day, fishing from the rocks, rounding up cows with the Dew children, or matching the milking in the late afternoon. Jane's young daughter, Mildred, taught them French, took them off on picnics, blackberrying. Lorette hardly saw them except swimming, and when they came home to roost at night, dog tired, sun blisters as big as $50 on their shoulders, scratches on their legs, and splinters in their leather hard feet, her heart suddenly sank. Her children! It had never occurred to her the hazard to a man of Hartley's sybaritic habits of taking on a ready-made family. He had always been excessively polite to Marguerite and Dwight, as though they were adults in miniature, but she had never observed any particular demonstration of interest in them. Even the usual sycophantic efforts on the part of a courting male to win favor. No candy, no jouncing on the knee or chucking under the chin, just a how do you do, and there's so long for now, with a cap doffed each time and a slight bow from the waist. And what must he think of their appearance? Their perennial costume of bathing suits, hair dry as straw and streaked from sun and water, eyes bloodshot and noses running from numerous underwater exploits in the lake. Not very attractive, she had to admit. She went inside, turned up the lamp in the front room, and took a long look that was meant to be appraising. Dwight was clutching a small glass jar in which he had imprisoned numerous fireflies. Most of them have given out their last flicker, but a few were still glimmering their weird green-white light against the glass. She remembered how proudly the boy had told her of this night light he had fashioned for Marguerite to use when the covers slipped off. See, all she has to do is shake the bottle and she's got a light to find the covers with. Apparently, on this particular night, he had used the light of the flickering bugs to pull sheet completely over himself and off his sister. Marguerite was rolled in a ball like a pill bug, knees pulled up under her, and only the almost black soles of her feet showing beneath her small rump. Lorette felt a sudden ferocity standing there by the bed. They had all come a long, rough road. She wanted peace and security for her children as well as herself, as an animal wants these things for its growing litter. Would Hartley love them? Could she ask him to love them? It seemed suddenly to Lorette that they might belong to a part of her that Hartley could not understand, an unruly, primitive part which perhaps he could not love. She did not know. There were so many things she didn't know. It was on one of these questioning nights that Hartley sat at his writing table, pondering the dedication for the finished manuscript of Peg. Presently, from the loose sheaves of paper scattered about the table, he pulled a clean white sheet toward him and, after a long moment of thought, wrote in his small, meticulous script, "To Laurie, in that which no waters can quench, no time forget, nor distance wear away. The bird of paradise," that's the next chapter. "Peg o' my heart, neatly bound, was Hartley's betrothal present to Lorette. With it went a modest little ring of small sapphires and diamonds. Their marriage waited only on the play's New York production. Lorette was enchanted with the finished script, and there was no question in her mind that this was the play she would do next. They took it at once to Cohen and Harris. After Hartley had finished reading 2 acts, Cohen stopped him. "I don't want to hurt your feelings, Hartley," he said, "but no matter how good the 3rd act is, it couldn't save the piece." He turned to Harris. There's nothing to it, is there, Sam? Not a thing, concurred Harris. No punch. Undaunted, Lorette proceeded to read the play to every Broadway producer who would listen. Her own soft brogue, as yet barely eradicated from her natural speech, must have carried extra persuasions to the producer's ears, but she fared no better than Hartley. The play was too mild, syrupy, no punch. It was hard to discourage Lorette with no, but as time drew on, the thinness of her purse and shoe soles accomplished it. Poverty was too familiar to be pleasant. On her rounds with Peg, she began to skip lunch and more frequently dropped by to see her friend Jane Peyton at the dinner hour. After a 6-month layoff, it was imperative she find a job. Oliver Morosco, ex-acrobat, who had come into the theater on a shoestring and built up a number of successful stock houses in the West, was eagerly eyeing Broadway as his next field of conquest. For his debut on The Great White Way, he shrewdly chose a play called The Bird of Paradise. It had enjoyed a successful run at his Burbank Theater in Los Angeles, with Louis Stone starred, and the popular Western actress Bessie Barriscale as leading lady. The New York production waited upon the casting of a Broadway name in the role of the tragic Luana to replace Miss Barriscale. There are different stories as to how Lorette came to get the part of the little Kanaka girl who takes a white man for a lover and eventually spurned, flings herself into the crater of a volcano. Oh, wow. Guy Bates Post, under contract to play $10,000 Dean, the beachcomber, claimed that he noticed the lean and hungry look when Lorette came to his wife's apartment and penciled in her name for the unfilled role. Another story is that Annie Morosco, the producer's wife, made the suggestion, having greatly admired Lorette in Seven Sisters. However, it came about. Morosco wired Lorette from Coast offering the part. On the bare outline of the play provided by Miss Morosco, Lorette accepted. She was immediately intrigued by the idea of playing a Hawaiian princess. It would be a break from the comedy and ingenue roles which had made her reputation in the East. And as early as this in her career, Lorette was determined not to be typed. That she would once again forfeit stardom was of minor importance. Hartley was not at all happy when he learned of Lorette's quick decision, and when he found she was to play a native girl who takes a white lover, wears a grass skirt, and does a hula, he was acutely distressed. Really, Laurie, I think this is most unwise, he told her, but he knew better than to press. Elizabeth was frankly shocked. She was broad-minded up to a point, but considered Luana an outlandish part and highly immoral. I'll never hold my head up with my friends again, and that's the truth. But Lorette had made up her mind. In Luana, she found what had been only crudely suggested in the character of Lone Star in Yosemite, around which her first dreams of legitimate theater had clung. At last, she could realize such a character, a child of nature, artless, passionate, delighting in her lover, without sense of sin or shame. She immediately set to work to master the special skills required for the part of fat little Hawaiian who, in Lorette's words, moved like a fat little wave, came to teach her the hula. When she could balance a gourd full of water on the back of each hand and undulate her hips without spilling a drop, he pronounced her proficient. 4 dusky musicians from Morosco had brought from the islands, came to her apartment every evening after rehearsal, sat cross-legged on the floor of a parlor and strummed their instruments while teacher and pupil danced. They would call to her over the music strange guttural words of encouragement and praise, and Lorette learned to answer back in their native tongue, eyes flashing, teeth gleaming, smile more brilliant than ever. It would seem at times as she danced that her skin had already taken on a darker hue. Hartley sat rather correctly in one corner of the room, chain smoking, not saying a great deal, and not very happy. Elizabeth stayed as far away as possible, working in a back room on Lorette's grass skirted costume. All doors closed between her and the atavistic cries and whining guitars of the little brown men in the parlor. Sometimes, according to her daughter, she wept as she sewed. Tenants in the walk-up apartment house began to complain. The spinster singing teacher downstairs, whose chandelier swayed under the nightly stompings, informed the landlord that 5 men were being entertained nightly by that actress and her mother upstairs. The landlord told Lorette she would have to move. Lorette appealed to Hartley for advice. He suggested that she use a little tact and asked the singing teacher to coach her in Luana's Hawaiian love song. In that way, the lady would realize that the dancing each evening was part of her job, not a nightly channel. It was a wonderful idea, Lorette recalled. I went down every morning before rehearsal for a lesson. She withdrew her complaint and I learned my song. I had the great satisfaction of singing the words directly at her in Hawaiian. I knew the translation. She didn't. If she had, she would have swooned. When Richard Walton Tully, the author, came from the West, Lorette ran into further opposition. He said she wouldn't do it at all for the part. She was too tall, too blonde, had a distinct Irish accent, and had never been to Hawaii. Lorette promptly offered to buy the dinners of any 2 Broadway actresses who had been there. Tully, rough spoken, quick tempered, made no attempt to conceal his displeasure. If he could have kept me out of the part, he would have, Lorette said, how he didn't want me. Throughout rehearsals, he continued to squabble with Lorette. Superciliously, he advised her to merely indicate the hula with a few motions, as she could never give it proper authenticity. When he stripped off his coat to demonstrate the basic steps, Lorette watched without comment. Dutifully, she confined herself to these basic motions, reserving her growing virtuosity for the evening sessions with her teacher. On one occasion, Tully snapped that she was much too sure of herself, that it was the nature of the Hawaiian to be apologetic for everything, for living, for loving, even for every word uttered. Lorette took this as a valuable key to the projection of the character. To know that about the Hawaiian even improved my accent and helped soften my vowels. She commented blandly that it had been delivered more as an insult than a suggestion was quite beside the point. It could be utilized in her work, and that alone was important. No amount of opposition could hold Lorette back. She was to express her sense of physical well being, of joy, to slough off the many emotional deprivations she had suffered as she climbed off the hard road to success. Life beckoned, and many hungers long suppressed flowed from Lorette into the primitive Luana, who was not afraid to give herself to life and to love. Even Hartley, in time, was wooed from tacit disapproval, and although he never considered Luana a proper role for Lorette, freely acknowledged the consummate skill of her portrayal. The Bird of Paradise opened at Daly's Theatre January 8, 1912. As a play, it received mixed notices. The seasoned principals, Theodore Roberts, Louis Stone, Guy Bates Post, individually gave good performances but failed to recreate the subtle magic of the Pacific Island paradise upon which the play largely depended. Lorette's Luana, however, was considered one of the immemorably authentic portraits of the theater. Stated one review, it is impersonation that for beauty of treatment, sensuous grace and charm, innate dignity, feminine coquetry, and poignant pathos deserves a place among the ambitiously great accomplishments of the modern stage. There was the familiar uproar over stardom, but this did not excite Lorette half so much as the enthusiastic reception of her hula. Miss Taylor's interpretation of the hula has captured New York. By painstaking study and care, she has reached past imitation to the spirit of the thing. The hula caught on like wildfire. Society Belles flocked to learn the dances of the Pacific, and who should be teaching them but Naich Kaiwei, the fat little man who moved like a fat little wave. Lorette had not forgotten Peg during the week's tryout of the Bird of Paradise in Rochester. She invited Morosco to her dressing room between matinee and night. Hartley was there, having come up for the opening, and Lorette introduced the two men. Mr. Manners, she said, had written a marvelous play, and she wanted Morosco to read it. It would be the making of him on Broadway. Morosco thanked her, but the bird was to do just that for him. As good as the bird was, Miss Taylor stated, this play was infinitely better. Wouldn't Morosco read it? No, he did not wish his attention distracted from his present production, even by a good play. Lorette, with an impatient shrug, subsided. Hartley had his own methods for handling such matters. After the night performance, he took the midnight train to New York with Morosco, discussing everything but his play, ascertaining that Morosco would return to Rochester for the Saturday performance. Hartley was on hand at the station bright and early, with a drawing room reserved for the two. Morosco scowled at the unusually chipper Englishman and warned him, "Don't you talk about your damn play," the author promised. As soon as they were in the drawing room, Hartley settled down for 40 winks on the divan. Then, apparently as an afterthought, he raised up an elbow and pointed to his briefcase. "By the way, old boy, in that little bag of mine over there, you might find a play or two to amuse you." "You go to the devil," was Morosco's reply, but fate was on Hartley's side. Morosco tried unsuccessfully to buy a newspaper, fingered through all the guides and maps in the car, then, shooting a look of deep distrust at Hartley's broad and inoffensive bag, also settled down for a nap, but sleep would not come. Finally, in desperation, he opened Hartley's bag, pulled out the first script that came to hand, and offered a page or two. After a page or two became so engrossed that he did not look up until the conductor called the change at Schenectady. Hastily, he wrote out a check for $500, drew up a short option, shook Hartley by the shoulder, and before the author was half awake, shoved the check and option into his hand. Hartley, rubbing his eyes, looked at the check and shouted, "Whoops, you want my play, do you? This calls for a drink." When I alighted from the train, Morosco concluded in his account of this incident, "I had under my arm Pego my heart, which, as is so often the case with theatrical producers, I had found quite by accident, and which was ultimately to make me over $5 million." Okay, I think we'll end it there for the night and pick up on Sunday. I will be taking calls tomorrow. Just a few more pages in this chapter. Probably just for my members again, but I have over 100 members. Thank you. Um, so that should be fun. We'll play some games. Oh, I think it's a new episode of Poker Face tonight. Yes, you're gonna sing and pray tomorrow. Um, I think my time of the month should be about done. So woohoo, on to the weekend. I love you so much. Sleep well. Mm. Oh, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, guys. I love you. Good night.